Welcome to this video for the course Thomas Aquinas on the Nature and Attainment of Happiness. This course is being presented by Marquette University and the Catholic University of Leuven. I'm Richard Taylor, and together with my colleague Professor Andrea Robilio at the Catholic University of Leuven, we present to you this fall 2014 course. This is class number 7, Al-Farabi and Avicenna on Happiness. This is video 7b, Avicenna on Happiness, in his Metaphysics Book 10. Ibn Sina or Avicenna, we'll start out with some general remarks, that is. First of all, Ibn Sina or Avicenna, born in around 980, and died in 1037, was and continues to be the dominant thinker of the long Arabic Islamic philosophical tradition. Quite evidently, a brilliant child born in Afshana, not far from Bukhara, Avicenna was provided tutors by his father for the study of mathematics, logic, law, medicine, and much, much more, so that he claimed in his autobiography that he had full mastership of the sciences by the age, sciences of the day, by age 18. This may in fact be true, or it may be an exaggeration from his autobiography. Nevertheless, every evidence indicates that he was an absolutely brilliant child, and quickly outpaced many of his tutors or teachers. For more details on this and for a valuable article on Avicenna, see the piece by Rizvi in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, but also see the substantial chapter by Robin Wisnowski in the Cambridge Companion to Arabic Philosophy. This will provide you more information on his life and his development. The piece on Avicenna in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is still in preparation. There'll be multiple pieces on the work of Avicenna. What is perhaps most important, though, is that Avicenna had no master or determinate tradition he was forced or required to follow in his philosophical and scientific thinking. As a result, this left him free to develop his own way in philosophy, something that becomes quite evident. The selection assigned for class consists of parts of Book 10 of his Metaphysics, so it's valuable to consider, at least briefly, what came earlier in that work, and also what Avicenna sets forth in his philosophical psychology regarding the nature of the first cause and the highest theoretical power of human beings, namely intellect. In his Metaphysics, Avicenna makes clear the subject matter of first philosophy, the benefits of his study, and the matters discussed in the science of metaphysics. For Avicenna sets out in this work a dialectical procedure which recognizes certain basic notions that are immediately present to the mind: the existent, the thing, and the necessary. These, he says, quote, are impressed in the soul in a primary way. So that's foundational for his discussion starting in Chapter 5 of Book 1 of the Metaphysics. Those notions impressed in the soul in a primary way. That begins the discussion that leads to, ultimately, to proof, to a proof of the existence of God, and much, much more about divine attributes in this work on metaphysics. The necessary being, later on in the book called The First Cause, is such that its existence is necessary without reference to anything outside itself. What remains of reality is possible of existence in its own right, but instantiated only because it has been made necessary or necessitated by the act of the necessary being, which is itself unique. Avicenna then later goes on, eventually, to explain the nature of the first cause, God, the nature of the act of creation, and how there can be immediate creation as a consequence of the requirement of divine simplicity. This is a complex metaphysics, and of course, here I can merely mention these issues. I'd urge you to study the thought of Avicenna in his Metaphysics. It's really quite brilliant, and we have a good translation by Michael Marmura. Well, let me continue. Through all of this, then, the first cause is stated and understood to be pure intellect, and of course it is also the necessary being, and Avicenna will say elsewhere that it has no essence other than its very being. So we proceed. In Book 9 of the Metaphysics, Chapter 7, on the topic of the return, that is, the afterlife, Avicenna writes of true religion set out by the Prophet Muhammad, who, quote, has set down for us the state of happiness and misery according to the body, close quote. Avicenna then writes the following. Then secondly, as regards the return, there is that which is apprehended by reason and demonstrative syllogism. This prophethood has confirmed. It consists of the happiness and misery established by syllogistic argument, and which belongs to souls, even though our estimative powers fall short of conceiving them now, due to causes which we will be explaining. The metaphysical philosophers' desire for attaining this latter happiness is greater than their desire for bodily happiness. Indeed, it is as though they pay no heed to bodily happiness, even if it is granted to them. They do not deem it great beside this happiness, which consists in drawing close to the first truth, and which we will be describing shortly. Let us then make known the state of this happiness and the misery that is its opposite, for the description of bodily happiness and misery has been completely given in the religious law. Close quote. There's much there then, but here, for our purposes in this class, with regard to the notion of happiness, we see here that he says, without hesitation, that the greatest happiness consists in drawing close to the first truth, which is God. And of course, that drawing close to the first truth will be done through intellect. So let's proceed further. So later on, he explains this happiness for the human soul. Quote, I'm still in the general remarks here. I haven't gone specifically to our text in Book 10. So let's proceed here. Or happiness for the human soul. He says this, quote, in the case of the rational soul, the perfection proper to it consists in its becoming an intellectual world in which there is impressed the form of the whole. That's the perfection of the rational soul. The order in the whole that is intellectually apprehended, and the good that emanates on the whole, beginning with the principle of the whole, and proceeding then to the noble, spiritual, absolute substances, then to the spiritual substances that in some manner are connected to bodies, then to the exalted bodies with their configurations and powers, and so on until it completes within itself the realization of the structure of existence in its entirety. It thus becomes transformed into an intelligible world that parallels the existing world in its entirety, witnessing that which is absolute good, absolute beneficence, and true absolute beauty, becoming united with it, imprinted with its example and form, affiliated with it, and becoming of its substance. Close quote. These are rather hyperbolic remarks on the part of Avicenna, but certainly it gives a sense that somehow the human soul comes to be one with an intelligible world, and its fulfillment or perfection is to be found in that, namely, in, as he says, quote, in its becoming an intellectual world. Close quote. Now, intellectual apprehension is human fulfillment, perfection, and happiness for Avicenna. Quote, if, on the other hand, the rational faculty had brought the soul to a degree of perfection by which it is enabled, when it separates from the body, to achieve that complete perfection that is appropriate for it to attain, its example would then be that of the benumbed person made to taste the most delicious taste and exposed to the most appetizing state, but who does not feel this, but who thereafter has the numbness removed, experiencing as a result momentous pleasure all at once. This pleasure would not be of the same genus as sensory and animal pleasure, but a pleasure that is similar to the good state that belongs to the pure, living, celestial substances. It is more elevated than every other pleasure and more noble. You can see obvious connections here with what Aristotle says, although now it's been transformed into the particular context of the day of Ibn Sina and his culture. That happiness Avicenna describes further as follows, and this is a long quotation over 2 slides. Quote, as to the question of how much conception of the intelligibles the soul of the human ought to achieve, so that by it he might transcend the bound in which the like of this misery is found, and where in crossing it and going beyond it this happiness is hoped for, this is something to which I cannot testify with any exactitude, but only by approximation. So he says, I am of the opinion that this entails that the human soul should have a true conception of the separate principles, having belief in them that is certain because of their existence for it through demonstration. Notice the approach here in science. You know it's true and have a true conception because it's certain through demonstration. I continue. That the soul should know the teleological causes of things occurring in universal motions, not the particular infinite ones. In other words, a teleological overview, and this is teleological through and through, this issue. That there should become established for it the structure of the whole cosmos, the relation of its parts to each other, and the order deriving from the first principle down to the most remote of the existence that fall within its arrangement. And the quotation continues further. This reveals a great deal about Avicenna's thought. So I continue. That the soul should conceive providence and the manner thereof, that it should ascertain what proper existence and what proper unity belongs to the essence that precedes the whole, namely God, and the manner in which this essence knows whereby neither multiplicity nor change attaches to it, seeking the perfection belonging to it, from the pleasure of perfection if realized for it, and from the feeling of pain when it falls short of attaining this perfection. Close quote. The realization of this intellectual understanding of all reality begins with the senses of the body, which is only a tool, according to Avicenna, a tool for the rational soul, a soul which is eternal into the future from the time of its creation in the body, though it leaves the body behind. So we move a little bit into the psychology of Avicenna. The rational soul uses the senses and internal powers of the brain, common sense, imagination, compositive imagination, estimation, cogitation, memory, to prepare the soul for the apprehension of intelligibles in act. This apprehension takes place when the soul is suitably prepared and connects with or receives an emanation from the separately existing agent intellect, where all the intelligibles in act exist in a primary way. Here, the agent intellect, lowest in the emanative hierarchy of intellects, souls, and celestial bodies, aids human beings in their fulfillment as knowers. The intelligibles apprehended are called abstractions, since they are separate from matter, and so the entire process can be called one of intellectual abstraction, described via the physical metaphors of connection or emanation. But the point is that the fullness of the content of knowledge does not come solely from the world and the process of abstraction from the world. Rather, the process described as abstraction is connecting with the separate agent intellect for the confirmation of the experiences, preparatory experiences in the world, and the confirmation of those by connection with the agent intellect where the intelligibles primarily exist. But I believe I discussed this earlier with some of the classes. Avicenna also describes this process as one involving the apprehension of middle terms in syllogisms, which for some very special human beings is very quick through what he calls HUDs, or an intuitive cognition. This is a power that the prophet has for understanding reality, in addition to the power of transforming intellectual knowledge into suitable likenesses and representations for those who are unable to attain the level of accomplished philosophers. Before turning to Avicenna's Metaphysics, Book 10, then, it's worthwhile to note the difference in tone and approach found in Avicenna and Al-Farabi, whose views are discussed in video 7a. In the account of Al-Farabi, we saw a rationalist explanation toward the end of which it was made clear that religion is a similitude or likeness of the truth found in its fullness in philosophy. He even states that philosophy is prior to religion, in some sense of priority not fully discussed or argued in that particular place. In the case of Avicenna, he makes it clear that he accepts Islamic religion with his philosophical analysis, and with his philosophical analysis he explains its practices and doctrines as required for the fulfillment of human beings. That is, he appears to provide in philosophy a justification of Islamic practices in some detail. This is rather unlike what Al-Farabi's doing, or the intentions of Al-Farabi, it seems to me. Yet still, Avicenna substantially agrees with the view that philosophy has some priority insofar as it is the clearest apprehension of the truth, a truth conveyed to lesser minds through religious symbols and similitudes. In this, he and Al-Farabi are, as you might say, on the same page or in full agreement. So let me start this account by following up on the remarks I just made. Here in Metaphysics, Book 10, Avicenna writes the following: "Know that most of what the populace confesses, takes refuge in, and upholds is true." Now I'm looking at this because of the tone that's set here by Avicenna. It is only those who are pseudo-philosophers who reject it, due to ignorance on their part of its grounds and causes. We have written on this subject in the Book of Piety and Evil. Reflect on the explanation of these things there, and believe what is related about divine punishments that fall upon corrupt cities and unjust individuals. Perceive how right is rendered victorious. Moreover, perceive that the cause of supplication on our part, of almsgiving and other things, and similarly the coming to be of injustice and evil, comes only from there. For the principles of all these matters terminate in nature, will, and coincidence. The principle of nature is from there. Continuing the quotation, "The volitions that have come, that we have, come into being after not being, and everything that comes into being after not being has a cause. Hence, every will we have has a cause. The cause of this will is not a will that regresses in this ad infinitum, but consists of matters that occur from external sources, terrestrial and celestial. The terrestrial terminates in the celestial, and the combination of all that necessitates the existence of the will. As for coincidence, it comes into being due to the collisions of these." This is chance he's talking about here now. "When all matters are analyzed, they are found to rest on the principles that necessitate them, descending from God, exalted be He. The decree from God, exalted be He, is the first simple placing of things, namely a place in the universe. Predetermination is that toward which the degree gradually directs itself, as though necessitating aggregates of simple things that are attributed, insofar as they are simple, to the first divine decree and command." Close quote. So everything in reality goes back to the divine, and our willing is affected by the many things around us in the physical world, and so those things, to the extent that they determine our will, then that goes back to the divine as well. This is a conciliation of philosophical doctrine with what might be described as the deterministic element found in the Quran. That approach is reflected earlier, where Avicenna writes the following, quote, "The relation of supplication to invoking this power is similar to the relation of cogitation to the summoning of clarification, all of which emanates from above. This does not follow the celestial acts of imagined representation, but the first truth knows all this in the manner we have said is appropriate to him, and from him begins the existence of all that comes to be. But this comes about through mediation. The same applies to his knowledge. It is by reason of these things that benefits are gained through prayers and offerings, particularly in the matter of seeking of rain and other things," he says. Close quote. A little later, he spells out his teleological approach in detail, and this is key for understanding Avicenna on happiness, and particularly on prophecy. Quote, "If you wish to know the things intellectually apprehended as useful and conducive to benefits that have been brought into existence in nature, in the manner of bringing to existence which you have known and ascertained, then contemplate the state of the usefulness of the organs in animals and plants, and how each has been created. There is for this no natural cause at all, but its principle is necessarily divine providence, in the way you know it in our previous discussion. In a similar way, one arrives at the true belief in these meanings, for they are dependent on providence in the way you have known providence to attach to these. Close quote. In Chapter 2 of Book 10, Avicenna provides a proof of prophecy based on the teleological necessity of the prophet and divine revelation, for the sake of the perfection and fulfillment of human nature as created by God. We have already seen with Al-Farabi that human nature requires human society and community with cities and other associations. This Avicenna calls partnership, musharaka, which involves justice and a lawgiver. Above all, though, a lawgiver. Now, the reasoning is this. Such need is possible. It is impossible for divine providence not to provide it. Good order requires it. Hence, quote, a prophet therefore must exist. And he must be human. He must also possess a special characteristic not present in other people. What characteristic is that? He will perform miracles about which we have been informed. Close quote. And regarding the prophet himself, Avicenna writes the following, quote, when this man's existence comes about, he must lay down laws, this is the role of lawgiver, about men's affairs by the permission of God, exalted be he, by his command, inspiration, and, quote, the descent of the Holy Spirit on him. It's a statement from the Quran. The first principle governing his legislation is to let them know that they have a maker, one and omnipotent. That, quote, he holds the hidden and the manifest, close quote. That obedience to his command is his due, for, quote, command must belong to him who creates, close quote. That he has prepared for those who obey him an afterlife of bliss, but for those who disobey him an afterlife of misery, so that the multitude will hear and obey the decrees put in the prophet's mouth by God and the angels. So this is he's finding evidence in the Quran for the sort of need for a prophet, which is parallel to his explanation of the teleological need for a lawgiver, as well found in his consideration of things of the world and in the consideration of the nature of human society. This is not unlike Al-Farabi. So, as I said, not unlike Al-Farabi, we see he writes further, quote, but he ought not to involve them, the prophet said, that is, the prophet ought not to involve them with anything doctrinal pertaining to the knowledge of God, that is the philosophical issue of it, exalted be he, beyond the knowledge that he is one, the truth, and has nothing similar to him. That's the limitation for those who are not sophisticated philosophical thinkers. And filled with philosophical understanding that the prophet has. Continuing, to go beyond this and obligate them to believe in his existence as being not referred to in place, as being not subject to verbal classifications, as being neither inside nor outside the world, nor anything of this kind, is to ask too much. Now, these are philosophical teachings he's indicating here. That is, God's existence is not in a place, and God, there are many names that cannot be said of God, and God, it's not right to say God is either inside or outside the world. God is not in a place, nor anything of this kind. I'll continue with the quotation then. The prophet will simply render, their task too great if he does this, confuse the religion they have, and cause them to fall into something from which deliverance is only for one who is divinely helped and led to success. The occurrence of whose existence is unusual, is coming to be most rare. The philosophical complexity, then, even if true, must not be shared with all. Quote, but he ought not to involve them with anything doctrinal pertaining to the knowledge of God. I'm repeating myself here. All right, I'm going to skip this slide then and go to the next. So, continuing that quotation, for it is only with great strain that they can conceive the true state of such matters in their true aspects. It is only the very few among them that can understand the truth of divine unity and divine transcendence. The rest would come to deny the truth of such existence, fall into dissensions, indulge in disputations and analogical arguments that stand in the way of their performing their civil duties. He's talking about Islamic theology here and the disputes within Islamic theology. This might even lead them to adopt views contrary to the city's welfare, opposed to the imperatives of truth. Their complaints and doubts will multiply, making it difficult for a human to control them. For it is not for everyone that the acquisition of divine wisdom is facilitated. So he's narrowing it down very much to those who are the elite, those who are the intellectual elite, the philosophers, who have the highest understanding. And for the rest, there must be, as Al-Farabi indicated, similitudes, likenesses, and texts that must not be explained, but rather are given over in religion to the people to believe. That there is knowledge hidden from the community of believers must not be made known or ever referenced as well. Rather, the prophet must use 1. Symbols and similitudes derived from things. 2. Accounts that, quote, instill in them the belief in the resurrection in the manner that they can conceive. And 3. He must tell them about eternal bliss and misery in parables derived from what they can comprehend and conceive. So we've seen that Al-Farabi said that, in fact, that religion is a subdivision of political science and belongs among the things that can persuade people. It's clear also, and Al-Farabi had also said that religion is an imitation of the truths found in philosophy, and here we have much the same with Avicenna. Further, according to Avicenna, quote, of the true nature of the afterlife, he should indicate only something in general, that it is something that, quote, no eye has seen and no ear heard, and that there are pleasures that are great possessions and miseries that are perpetual torture. Close quote. Now, why does Avicenna emphasize this? Well, I want to call your attention to an article by my late Professor Michael E. Marmura on Avicenna and Traditional Islamic Belief, and this is published in the volume of papers, The Judeo-Christian Islamic Heritage, Philosophical and Theological Perspectives, which I edited with Professor Irfan Omar from the Theology Department. The proceedings of a conference that took place, I believe it was in 2009, and our publication came out in 2012. In that particular work, Avicenna talks about the problem that philosophically the soul is the human soul is the rational soul only and not the body. So according to the philosophy of Avicenna, the doctrine taught among philosophers is that in fact there is no resurrection of the body at all. In this article, Avicenna points out how Avicenna raises the issue that perhaps, and tries to solve it in order to reconcile his belief with traditional Islamic teachings, which do hold for resurrection. Avicenna tries to reconcile this by saying that perhaps, as one philosopher has said, perhaps the dead imagine themselves to be in bodies and resurrected. Not that this is true, but perhaps the dead imagine themselves in this way. And as Marmura works through the article, he finds reason to believe that this may be attributed to Al-Farabi, but that's too complex to get into at this point. But the point here I want to make is that Avicenna does not give up his philosophical principles here, and rather holds to philosophy, and in his philosophy denies the resurrection of the body, even though it is traditional Islamic belief. So here we have an example of how traditional Islamic belief then is allowed to persist, but the real meaning is not identical with the truth of traditional Islamic belief, but rather with the philosophical account. Hence, the traditional Islamic belief is a similitude and something to be taught to those who are not among the intellectual elite. This is getting to be a long video, so I want to wrap this up pretty quickly. Chapter 3 of the assigned reading which has the title On Acts of Worship, Their Benefits in This World and the Next, close quote. This chapter details how Islamic religion is in accord with the teleological account required by philosophy, and I leave that for you to read. Chapter 5 is described as, quote, concerning the Caliph and the Imam, the necessity of obeying them, remarks on politics, transactions, and morals, and concerns qualifications for the legislator, as well as detailed practical directives in imperfect situations. You'll recall that Al-Farabi had given great detail about the necessity of having all the precise and particular considerations under control by the legislator, so that the legislator may best bring about law in the cultural and political context, even the geographical and climate context of the people for whom he's seeking to be legislator. So this is not unsimilar, as I say here. And finally, my last slide. Finally, Avicenna closes with a clear statement of his view of happiness. He says, quote, whoever combines theoretical wisdom with justice is indeed the happy man. Whoever, in addition to this, wins the philosophic qualities becomes almost a human god. Worship of him after worship of God, exalted be he, becomes almost allowed, although not really. He is indeed the world's earthly king and God's deputy in it, close quote. So this is the prophet, and by here he's referring to, he's also understood to be referring to Muhammad as well. So, for Avicenna then, happiness in its highest state is theoretical wisdom with moral virtue in the form of justice and the guidance of society toward the fulfillment and perfection that human beings are able to have, insofar as is possible for the individuals in that particular society. And this concludes a long video on Avicenna for our class number 7, which is going to take place this coming Thursday. And I'll stop here.